Hey everybody, it's me. Hey everybody, it's me, True Power's Mine, and this is Special Report. Thank you all for tuning in. I'm getting ready to call Professor Katz and Pompey Fixico, the elder, and this is going to be an exciting show. Today's date is March 13th, 2019, the year of our Lord. So let me get the doctor on. Professor and Fixico.
Hello.
Hello, Professor. It's Patrick again.
Yes.
I got everything going now. We're actually live. I'm getting Brother Fixico, Pompey Fixico on the other line, and we'll just take it from here.
Okay.
Oh, he must. I'm sure he'll be.
I can also give out my website. People can read things there for free, so on.
Yeah. Do you want to give out your website real quick, and I'll give a film.
Oh, that would be good. Okay, it's my name, WilliamLKatz.com.
That's WilliamLKatz.com. Hey, Brother Nilk, welcome to the show.
And that's it. Yeah. At AOL. Yeah.
At AOL. And do you have hey Cobra, welcome to the show. Do you have any Facebook or Twitter or Instagram?
Yes, I'm on Twitter. Once again, William Loren Katz, Twitter.
Yes, the chat room saying hi to you, sir. Okay, I'm going to try Brother Pompey Fixico again.
Sure.
And get him on.
Hello.
Hello, Brother Pompey. We got you on the line.
Yeah.
We already have Brother Katz on the line. If you two would like, could you guys just please give an introduction to the audience and just let everybody know who you are?
Okay. Let me just start. I'm just an historian, and I've written 40 books, many on the subject of African American history and Black Indians. And Pompey and I met a few years ago, actually longer than that, teamed up, and he also introduced me to the big conference we had on Black Indians in Florida back in 2012. And we've done a number of broadcasts and other work together since. And what he represents is really important. He is a living embodiment of all of his ancestors who throughout this history were part of the great resistance of Native Americans and African Americans to the march of European conquest. And he can talk about that further.
Absolutely. Brother Pompey, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay. And you want to just briefly give a kind of like a synopsis to the audience? Many of them are not aware of who you are and what you stand for, and sir. And I just want to say thank you as a indigenous American citizen. Thank you for your work.
Thank you, and I have permission from Professor Katz as an elder to speak. And I say, good afternoon. And in the language of the Okanisi in the Yucca Maroons, and to describe myself, I would say, culturally, I'm an aspiring Seminole Maroon descendant. But to the people of America that see me on the street, I'm just another flavor of black. I would say that the genealogists and historians have described me, my ancestry, as 1/8 Seminole Indian, 1/4 Seminole Maroon, 1/8 African Creek, 1/4 African Cherokee, and 1/4 African American white. And I hope after today that this show will be a magic wand to enlighten people about this powerful diversity that we all are living with.
Yes, yes, that is so true. Professor, do you have any information about the earliest humans on this continent of North America?
The earliest humans?
Yes, sir.
Well, that's a little bit in dispute. I can tell you about the mixture of the two people and how that began.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Because that's where I really begin my book, Black Indians. And by the way, people can go to my website, williamlkatz.com, and they can read articles for free on many of the subjects Pompey and I will be talking about today. But I trace this alliance of two people back to 1502, when Governor Ovando of Hispaniola comes over to take over command as governor and replace Columbus. And he brings with him about 100 enslaved Africans. And almost as soon as they reach here, some of them start fleeing and they go into the hinterland away from the Spanish villages, and they're taken in by Native Americans. And Governor Ovando writes to King Ferdinand complaining that his Africans fled to the Indians, and he uses this phrase, never could be captured. And I think that means a lot more than it was difficult finding where they were.
Yes.
They had actually been taken in by Native Americans and made part of the family, so on. And the reason for that, nothing to do with skin color, it had to do with the fact that the first Europeans who came here enslaved the first people they saw, Native Americans. So they had a taste of what it was. And when they peeked out among the bushes and saw the Spaniards and the Africans, they noticed the Spaniards had guns and whips, and the Africans were working for them or they were beaten. And out of this grew an alliance. I'm going to say this slowly, because these African and Native American people became our first freedom fighters. First, long before Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, and George Washington. And they came together to make a society that treated them and everybody else fairly and as equals.
That's absolutely right on. So where did, after the alliance, how did the Native peoples get in the situation that they find themselves in to this very day?
I'm having a little trouble hearing you.
Oh.
Talk a little louder.
How did the Native Americans, indigenous folks, get in the situation that they find themselves in today as far as the reservations and basic oppression?
Well, this was a continuation story. The Native Americans were the first enslaved, and they escaped, and then they met with the Africans. But when the Europeans, the Native Americans were starting to die off from overwork and so on, and so the Europeans had to bring in Africans because they couldn't do all the hard labor here, and they made the Africans do it. And once that system got underway, the Europeans found it was better to not insist on enslaving Native Americans because they were all over the place and they could attack you.
Yes.
So they kind of let them slip out. But they held the Africans as slaves, made up all kinds of stories. Today we call it racism, saying they were inferior, they needed white control, they didn't have, they were not Christians, which was true. They couldn't speak European languages, which was largely true. And on that basis, they enslaved them. Native Americans, they tried to contain them in other ways, put them on reservations, cleared them out of the East, put them out in Oklahoma, made it a federal Indian territory. Thousands were marched out there. And Pompey could tell you about some of his relatives that were part of some of these great events.
Yes, absolutely. Brother Pompey, can you tell us about the Trail of Tears and your ancestors?
Well, yes, I can. But I would like to add on to what Professor Katz, the question that you asked him about the inhabitants, the early inhabitants of, some people call this Turtle Island, meaning that the original land mass surrounded what we call America, and they broke apart into other continents. But I wrote a poem about this mentality. It's very short, but I would like your permission to read this poem.
Absolutely. Please share it with us.
Mama America. Africa is grandma now. Mama, mommy, we need your milk of understanding while we learn to understand ourselves. We need your unconditional love and the magic mercy of your maternal instinct. Let us shout with joy as we pass through your gates and kiss the ground where you gave us birth and breath. Mama America, show us your freedom mountain. Help us climb the stair. Guide us along your lighted path that leads to our transcendence. Mother, we will be good children, proud sons and daughters. Just let us rest and grow close, so close upon your breast. Man.
That was beautiful. That was beautiful.
Yeah,
if only given the chance.
His relatives back, Pompey, how far can you go back in the Americas to your relatives that were part of this mixture of indigenous people and African people?
Well, you know, the first documentation of black maroons going into Florida, that was around 1687. And then they were here in 1750 when the group that is called Seminoles came down from Georgia. So I do have a ancestor, Renty McIntosh Renty, who is documented that he came from Cameroon, Africa. They called it then French Nigeria. And he's...
let me just step in and say what Pompey is describing becomes the strongest, most unified resistance of Black and Indian people here in North America. He's talking about Florida. Florida was largely settled by escaped Africans fleeing south from the Carolinas and Georgia. And there was a split in the Seminole, it was a Creek nation, and the Seminoles split and came down. They were persecuted, and they wanted to get away from the Creeks, and they came down, headed south, and then when they got into Florida, they were embraced by the Africans who taught the methods of rice cultivation they had learned in Senegambia and Sierra Leone. And on that basis, these two people built an alliance, and I'm going to say this slowly, that held the United States Army, Navy, and Marines at bay from about 1816 for the next 42 years until you got to the Civil War. And these Africans and Native Americans, they were fighting the strongest European army on the continent, and yet they had to move their women and children out of harm's way as they fought. And they still fought. After the army was tied up, U.S. Army was tied up in Florida. This is an incredible record. And Pompey's relatives way back then were part of this resistance. Could you take one of them, for example, Pompey?
Well, thank you so much, Bill, for stepping in and adding that great bit of information. And Brother Patrick mentioned the Trail of Tears. Mm-hmm. Well, the truth of the matter is, because the Seminoles fought that 7-year war against the United States, the biggest war of removal in their history, when they began to immigrate to Indian territory, the United States did not allow them to go on cross the slave states on the Trail of Tears. They took them from Tampa on steam schooners to New Orleans. And now later, when the Civil War was about to begin, under Antoakwa Yahola, the great Creek chief, he was called the Loyal Indians, and they had a group, and Bill can add something to this. Sure. It was mostly Creek, some Seminoles, and Black interpreters. I had many relatives in that group. But let me just say this, and I'll turn it over to Bill. When they fought 3 battles in the first year in 1861, the first year, that was Blacks and Indians fighting Confederate troops and Confederate Indians. When they fled into Kansas, they called it the Trail of Blood on Ice. Oh. So that's something I want. Bill, please help me with all.
Yeah, this was it was a part of the Civil War that's been neglected. But when the Union, Lincoln, withdrew the troops from the Indian Territory and the Confederates moved in, they tried to force the Native Americans and the Africans living among them to do their heavy work for them, build the forts, and they revolted. And thousands of them just split, and they got they had one chief, Apostle Yehola, as Pompey mentioned, and he opened his huge plantation to 10,000 men, women, and children. And the Confederates came after them. These people set out, and they tried to round up some more people who they knew who did not want to be part of the Confederacy, and they finally fought their way through. And what Pompey said, this trail of blood on ice, all the way up into the Union territory. And many of the young men volunteered for service, and they became, as he said, part of the early battles of the Civil War, involved in 4 different states in territory in what was called the Trans-Mississippi West. And this is during the Civil. I just stumbled on this, and I've issued a new version of my book that's coming out in May, The Black West, in which I talk about this part of the Civil War in great detail.
Wow, that's so I mean, never heard of the blood of
that's right.
Trail of Blood.
You don't hear of them. They're not part of the story.
Wow.
And Brother Patrick, to answer your question about my ancestors, I had 3 direct ancestors on that Trail of Blood ice. And, Caesar Bruner, my great grandfather. I had Osa Ego. He was with Opioid, and I had he was a black blood, and I had Dick Renty, who was an African Creek, and a lot of cousins, but those I had 3 direct ancestors amongst those people on the Trail of Blood.
Wow, that's so you know, gentlemen, honestly, thank you. Thank you. This is just blowing me away. I mean, to know that the Confederates actually had Indians fighting on their sides, I kind of knew that. But as far as relocating the folks, that this is huger than the Japanese internment. It's huger than the German internment of World War II. This is the largest movement of men, women, and children in this United States history on the continent. And no one gives you the full story.
These are our first freedom fighters, and you don't read about them in any school textbook. I mean, that's what I've been trying to bring out as an historian in my book, Black Indians, and the other writing I've done on it. And by the way, my book, Black Indians, is going to be coming out later on this year in a recorded book version for those who prefer that.
Wow, thank you. I'm just so blown away because my mind is racing here. You know, how many more lies have we been subjected to in public education? And then, gentlemen, the real question is, what is the purpose of skewing all this history?
What's the purpose of stealing?
Or skewing, or not mentioning.
I'd like to answer that. What you have is a narrative that gives the credit for the founding and development of North America, and particularly the United States, to white men, pioneers. And those who came over they enslaved the first people they found, and when they couldn't do that so easily, they brought in the Africans, and they were not about building freedom for hundreds of years until they wanted to rest free of the British Empire. And that's why you didn't see them in movies. You didn't see black men, Native American men riding off into the sunset after great victories. It contradicted the John Wayne picture that the movies conveyed for many, many years.
Wow, that's so true. That's so true. Because if you stifle people's minds, you give them a false pass guess what? They'll never rebel against you. They'll never seek liberation.
And I've had, after some of my lectures that I've given, I've had some of the students at John Jay College and elsewhere come up, and they had tears in their eyes, and they had one big question for me. Mr. Katz, how come we never learned this? It was just a shock to them. This is an incredible heritage, and it deserves to be known by everybody.
Yes. Talk about sense of pride.
Excuse me, Professor Katz, would you touch on Fort Negro? You wrote so beautifully about Fort Negro.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Oh, could you talk about Fort Negro? You wrote a beautiful article about that.
Fort Negro was the first big battle. When the United States invaded Florida in 1816, a number of the Africans had taken over a fort called Fort Negro on the Apalachicola in Florida that the British had left after the War of 1812. And the Americans sent down Marines, they sent down a flotilla, and they sent down Army soldiers and scouts and so on, attacked it, couldn't defeat it, but they heated up a cannonball that just happened to land in the ammunition dump and blew the place apart, killing hundreds of people who were there, mostly African men, women, and children. They marched the others back to slavery. Well, they thought that would take care of the resistance, but it only led to continuing resistance. And I think, Pompey, you must have had some relatives who were there fighting, did you?
Yes, I did. Thank you, Bill. I'm related to Prophet Abraham, who was also a member of the Black British Colonial Corps Wing. And this is what the national anthem controversy is about. In Washington, during the War of 1812, Francis Scott Key, a slave owner, had a militia of slave owners that was guarding the Bladensburg Road. That was the road that led to Washington. The British Army sent the Black British Corps of Royal Marines, all black, to attack them. And in a fair fight, Henry and the slave owners ran away. They called it the Bladensburg Race.
Yes.
After that, he wrote the national anthem. And in the third stanza, where he talks about the blood, the doom of the grave, the slave, that he was talking about those Black British colonial Marines that ran him off, allowing Britain to burn Washington, meaning that blacks had to kill Washington a second time. Now, how does that connect to Fort Negro? My ancestor, Prophet Abraham, had been a British colonial marine coming out of the Pensacola band of refugees, and he was in and around Fort Negro when the attack occurred. And what's important about Fort Negro is it would have been the beginning of a maroon homeland, because there were black farmers all the way for 50 miles up and down the Apalachicola River before Madison and Andrew Jackson sent the task force and built a plane to destroy them. Thank you.
I want to just add one other thing. I have to leave. I have another interview to do. But what Pompey is talking about is that here his people, this mixture, was so brave and has been left out. And Pompey has formed and is president of a Maroon Historical Society for North America. And as such, he's been invited by other Maroon descendants. He will tell you about these in the Caribbean, Mexico. We've done broadcasts together about them, trying to bring these people together. And there's another little element that I hope you'll detail so people can help out. But Pompey has been asked to come to New York and speak on April 17th of this year to the United Nations, along with these other people who invited him. And he can give you a website, because we need some help in raising money so we can make the trip here and be present.
Yes.
And also people can come down and hear him. So I'm going to sign off, and by leaving him with that and the other important things he has to tell you. I'll be happy to be on again if you want me on.
Absolutely.
With Pompey or whatever, and we can talk about aspects we haven't even gotten to, like how the alliance of Black Indians stayed together after the Civil War and accomplished all kinds of things, taking part in marches with Dr. Martin Luther King, Dick Gregory, all over the country.
What?
Okay, Pompey, I'll be signing off. And once again, those interested further, you can go to my website, williamlkatz@aol.com. And also, you can put in my name, William Loren Katz, on Twitter, and you can pick up threads of things there. Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor Katz. I will put both of those links in the description below once I process this video. Pompey, could you hold tight? I want to get you off of the Facebook, and I want to call you on the line. So, okay. And then we can take you up from there. Awesome. This is such a great, this is so much information. I never even knew. Wow. This is, we're calling, Elder Fixico back on the phone line now.
Hello.
Okay, hold on one second. Let me, I have a little bit of, there we go. Okay. Sorry about that. Sorry about the feedback, everybody. Once again, this is a one-man production, so therefore I have nobody else to blame but myself. Okay, brother Pompey, tremendous information you and Professor were sharing with us. It's just mind-blowing, especially about Fort Negro, about the ramification of the Marines doing their thing.
And the national anthem.
Yes.
And being connected to Fort Negro. And I have some more to add to that. And Fort Negro, in its real-time history, would have become the center of a Maroon land that would have been similar to what happened in Haiti. Because before the U.S. Civil War, we had basically 4 types of American blacks that have been described. We only hear about 3. We hear about the house enslaved person,
yep,
the field enslaved person,
yep,
and the free, so-called free person.
Yes.
But we don't hear about the 4th type, the maroon. And what the maroon, the significance of marronage is those enslaved people who found a way to escape either on their own or with the help of others. And they crossed the border and they went into an area very inaccessible, and they formed an alliance with others. It could have been Indians. It could have been even other European nations that were against their former oppressors. And they even formed strong alliances with the environment. They would live where no one else could live, in the swamp, in the mountains, and wherever. And then after doing that, there's another level of marriage. Once you've escaped, once you're in alliance, then you turn and fight your former oppressor to maintain your freedom. That's called a maroon society right there in alliance. And then a higher level, which is what my ancestors with the Black Seminoles did, were they did all that, and they won a sign of a treaty. They actually won the first emancipation treaty called Jessup's Emancipation Proclamation, Jessup's, and it was in March 6, 1837, where the United States Army was over half of their total members in Florida, said that we cannot beat the alliance of the Maroons and the by-blood Indians. So what they did, General Jessup, he decided to say, well, let's allow the blacks to go under this Indian Removal Act to Indian territory if they stop fighting. And so many of my black ancestors, even those who had been at Fort Negro, they agreed. And so they were actually freed by a treaty to go. Now, once they got there, 12 years later, under President Polk and a new attorney general, they went back on that. And half of my ancestors had to escape into Mexico, where my cousins are there now in Nacimiento de los Negros. They're there now, the cousins and descendants of that group that went, while the other half would stay and eventually go on the trail of blood on ice. Now, I have something that, I can read to you about that, but it takes 3 minutes. I don't know if you have that time.
Yeah, no, listen, this has been hidden from us all these years. We can make time, brother.
Okay, I promised when I met my cousins, because I didn't even find out who I was until I was 52 years old. Wow. And that had been hidden from me. And there's a big story behind that. But I'll read this to you and for your listeners, and I think they'll find it interesting. Now, remember, and you had asked the question, why are we where we are now with blacks and Indians? That's another whole big part about it. Let me just say before I read this, that when the colonizers came, there were Indians shortly thereafter who would hunt enslaved people and others wouldn't. And in my reading of history, I find out that the Indians who would hunt runaway enslaved people were those Indians who had a lot of contact with the European colonizers, and they had become literally addicted to the European trade goods. But the Indians in the interior, they would welcome blacks. And so, to me, that's the difference. But now, here, this will explain how my ancestors, half of them left Wewoka. That's where the Klan murdered my grandfather, because his land was on an ocean of oil. That's another part of it. But let us just go here. The holiday known as Juneteenth is not celebrated by the Black Seminoles of Brackettville, Texas, in the classic sense. When President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, the Black Seminoles were already free. they had won their freedom 25 years earlier through direct combat with U.S. forces during the Second Seminole War. In 1837, the terms of their freedom were negotiated at Fort Dade, Florida. A little over 500 formerly enslaved people were allowed to go free if they stopped fighting and immigrated to Oklahoma with their Indian allies. This agreement was entitled the Articles of Capitulation, or popularly known as Jessup's Proclamation, named after Major General Thomas Sidney Jessup. It, just like Lincoln's proclamation, was an example of battlefield legislation done under war powers. In 1849, due to pressure from the slave industry, America passed the Fugitive Slave Act, permitting slave owners to pursue their former slaves even into Indian territory. And the Attorney General's decision reversing Jessup's proclamation made it impossible for some of them to stay. The following year, a contingent of black Seminoles left the United States, entering into Mexico, where we say, Los mexicanos dirán bienvenidos con los brazos abiertos. The Mexicans welcomed us with open arms. Where they were welcomed with open arms, Mexico needed border guards right after the Mexican-American War, where they lost all that territory. And they were glad to have veteran guerrilla fighters on their side of the border. After the Civil War had ended and slavery was abolished in the U.S., the black Seminoles returned. One of our most important dates was July 4th, 1870. On that day, we chose America as immigrants and splashed back across the Rio Grande to become special forces for the Buffalo Soldiers in a unit known as the Seminole Negro Indian Scout. That unit won 4 Congressional Medals of Honor in defense of their country, the United States of America. What you think about that, Brother Patrick?
Wow, that's history. That's the complex, convoluted history of this nation. You had Native Americans who basically become seduced by the European lifestyle, turns on ancient traditions, turns on people, capturing slaves. You have Negro men fighting as Buffalo Soldiers to ensure that basically the colonizers are successful in the way. But one question I want to ask, and this is kind of a historical question. Don't you find it odd, Brother Pompey, that all the people are at this time are located along the eastern coast of the United States, when science tells us that they immigrated from the ice bridge coming down through Canada and presumably the western part of America? You would think that there will be people already populated in the Oklahomas and the Iowa territories, but those were no man's lands. There was no people out there. What I'm asking is, in your heart to hearts, do you foresee that black folks sailed the seas thousands of years ago and immigrated to this country on the eastern side of the whole continent, from North America to South America?
Well, and your question is that were we here?
Yes.
Before the crossing of the land bridge?
Yes.
Well, this is the theory known as Turtle Island, where again it was when way back when it was one landmass, and then it broke up. So then you have the from everywhere and all in place concept of how the blacks get distributed over the world. You know, they just come out of Africa and you know, go from continent to continent where there's others here. See, first of all, I ain't no historian. I'm an informed descendant and a crusading
warrior
activist. But I don't know that one, Patrick, and maybe someone will call in. And now there's another thing. I've also been a member of the Buffalo Soldiers for 15 years, and I was always, and because my ancestors were special forces for them during the Indian War, and people say, well, how can you work? You're part Native American, and yet you're in the Buffalo Soldiers, and Buffalo Soldiers help to put the Indians in check. I love the way a host said that. And I said, yes. And I say, this is true. There were Indians and there were Indians. When my black ancestors was escaping under Wildcat from Indian territory, leaving from Wewoka, they were protected by Indians. They were protected by Seminole and Creek Indians mostly. But in the second group, when my Bowlegs ancestors didn't leave with the first group that had protection by treaty passing through the Great Comanche War Trail, they were captured, tortured, and killed by Indians. And there's a famous example of, I'll never mention the name of the nation, there's a famous example of two young black girls from the Bowlegs party where those Indians had burned their skin to see how deep their black went. Wow. And, you know, so I'll say they're Indians and they're Indians. And I'll say in defense of the Buffalo Soldiers, they weren't part of the United States troops that massacred Indians. And they oftentimes protected Indians to get them back on the reservation, which was at a concentration camp. And oftentimes it was, you know, it was a choice. You go in or you be dead. So, you know, I'm willing to talk to anyone about that. It raises, all I can say is there were Indians and no Indians.
You know, this
so
is
now,
a kind of a personal
does that answer your question, Patrick?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, Brother Pompey. This is kind of a personal question.
Yes.
Knowing that you have so much history that's tied to your DNA, to your blood that's flowing through your veins right now, how do you not have a major hate towards colonizers in general?
Well, you know, there's good and bad amongst people. Mm-hmm. And some of my own people can be mean and nutty. But what I am doing is I'm working to begin a movement, and I've been working to begin a movement known as Transcendence. Now, Transcendence comes out of a sociological construct that occurred around Ellis Island based on those immigrants. And it was a Jewish sociological
experiment.
Doctor of sociology who wrote about it. And later, Dr. Ray Van Robertson, a Pan-Africanist professor, he was at Lamar. I don't know where he's at now. He wrote a beautiful piece called Estelusty Marginality. Estelusty means Este means man, lusty means black Indian marginality, because the current day Indians that you ask, they were marginalizing the black Indians who had traditionally been with them, you see. And so it came down to money.
Yes.
And in this movement, Transcendence, that I am have been promoting for some time, in part, there are, to someone who has double ambivalence, like to someone says, well, am I an Indian or am I black? And they have some feelings about being both. Well, you know, one of the biggest growing demographics now is mixed race. But this theory says, how does a minority react to the marginalization of a dominant culture person? And he was speaking, Von Robinson was speaking about Indians being marginalized by blacks in the Indian Territory today. And Wiesberger was speaking about how European immigrants in Ellis Island felt entering into society. And so the construct goes like this. There normally are 4 reactions by a minority that are being marginalized. The first is they return to their group. They can't join that group that they want to become that's a dominant culture. The second is poise. They say, well, I know I'm as good as you, whatever you say.
Right.
And the third is assimilation, where they will do anything to assimilate. But the fourth and the least most practiced of those responses is called transcendence. That's where the marginalized minority finds a way to rise above the marginalization of the dominant person and form their own group.
Yes.
And so that is at the heart of what I'm doing with the concept of maroons. The concept of maroons can apply to all those during the Civil War, those enslaved blacks that escaped. That was an act of war.
Yes.
They deprived the Confederacy of their labor. When they crossed the line, crossed the border, and began to work for the Union, men, women, and children, that was another act of war. When the men joined the army and fought, all of these are prerequisites for being able to be called a maroon. And plus, they won their freedom through a treaty and a proclamation. And so, therefore, I'm saying, I'm advising descendants of that era, of those people, to consider, say, well, I'm African American, but I'm also a maroon descendant. And the maroons were freedom fighters. You know, that's what I'm promoting. What do you think about that, Patrick?
I think it's awesome. I think it is the essence of what this country should have been founded on, and it is freedom. Freedom to live your life, freedom to love your family, freedom to respect and show dignity to your ancestors for what they all done, and to each other presently. Because right now, Brother Pompey, I feel just in general now, our group, our people have been stripped of dignity. It has been replaced with envy and foolishness. We have been stripped of families, and it has been replaced with drugs and gangs. And we have been stripped of our spirituality, which has been thoroughly replaced with consumerism. I think it would do us best to go back to the old ways.
Beautiful. And it's 2 things that I can say that I'm asking. Maybe it's a third. Number one, I'm asking all Black, African American families, whoever, now, every year when you get together with the family, interview your elder,
yes,
write it down, let those who witness the real-time description of where the family came from and all of those names and sound like names, and then take it and have it witnessed
by a community person, a doctor, a police person, a lawyer. After that, have it notarized. Then what you have created is a legal document.
Yes.
So when this era comes up about people are talking about reparations, I cannot use the term reparation because I'm a private sector partner for the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom 1994 Act, passed down by President Clinton in the middle of the Monica Lewinsky scandal. And when I was brought into that position, I was informed that the person who was on said we don't use reparations because that's a legal term. Because when they had us down in St. Augustine, they actually created a conference that reunited the Black Seminole, the Gullah Geechee, and the Yamasee. And the Black Seminoles was from Bahama. They were from Oklahoma. I was coming out of California, and they were also from Mexico. But when I said, is this reparations? They said, no, we don't use that word. So I'm asking blacks to create an oral history as a legal document. And then what I'm doing is, because I was rejected when I went, even though I have the documentation to join the Oklahoma Seminole Nation as a by blood member, but I have refused to do it because I'm standing in solidarity with my cousins who have the same genealogy as me, but they don't have the documentation that I had. That's another whole story, but something important I want to tell you, because you can look at the video concerning Fort Negro, where 270 defenders were destroyed by the United States of that era. 200 of them were women and children, and 75 plus were male warriors. They were the remnants of the British colonial Marine, and there was a few Choctaw and some Seminoles. In 2016, just before the election, they decided to have a bicentennial commemoration of that massacre of Fort Negro. And they invited me to come and represent the Maroon victims, which was a tremendous through the roof honor.
Wow, this is real history.
And there's a videotape on it too. There, I did perform the Seminole Maroon Peace Belt ceremony that I've done, across the United States and in the Caribbean. And so now, I have for some years now been the North American Maroon representative of the Maroon Women Chamber of Cooperation of the Caribbean. That means those members that are leaders of the Maroons of Jamaica, Trinidad, Suriname. There's 120,000 Maroons in Suriname alone. Those women chose me to be their North American representative. And as such, I will be accompanying them to the United Nations Forum on Indigenous Issues, Indigenous Rights, and I will be the United States representative for Maroons. And people say, well, who is a Maroon? I say this: all the descendants of the Civil War and any other recorded event should call themselves Maroon descendants. And so what is a Maroon in the United States? A Maroon in the United States would be someone, say like someone in Oklahoma or the Gullah Geechee in South Carolina, who are still on the land that their ancestors won. Now, how am I called a Maroon? I always self-identified as a Maroon descendant, But when I went to Suriname, the ambassador to Trinidad for Delia Grand Galon, she told me, she says, your color is the color of the overseer, but your life is the life of the maroon, because you're still fighting the battle that our ancestors fought. So they only want to recognize me as a maroon, not a maroon descendant. But to scholars, I identify myself as a maroon descendant who don't understand that concept.
Now, Brother Pompey, a couple of things. One, could you give us the GoFundMe account so that, you know, people could, you know, take upon themselves, you know, to give funding for that? And two, is there any hope that we could put together some sort of coalition or envoy to go to the World Court to seek justice?
Well, thank you. You asked us some beautiful questions. Number one, if they go to my Facebook page, Fixico, Fixico, and thank you so much for that beautiful video that you did, Patrick. And I would say this, my position at the United Nations, at that Forum for Indigenous Issues and Indigenous Rights, is this. For us of America, we are not immigrants. We were kidnapped victims. And our indigeneity, whatever you want to call it, was completely systematically destroyed.
Wow.
We don't know where we came from. We don't know who we were, what our language was. And since that was systematically, completely destroyed before we would become the workers that they needed, that must be replaced to us.
Yes.
How can it be replaced? You heard me say the Mama America poem. It can be replaced by a law, an act, or a treaty, giving us on paper indigenous rights. What are indigenous rights? Well, Indians have their own community. They have their own police force. Yes. It would be great if we had a security force in our community that acted in liaison with the city police. And it was legal because we are under a special form of citizenship. It would be great if we had our own casinos and lottery stations in our community, and they would be run under the condition that the proceeds would be recycled, because we're not good at that, into our community in the form of small business loans and in the form of vocational training to work in those businesses that we're creating. Another layer of strengthening it, and in the form of college tuition or whatever. What do you think about what I just said, Patrick?
I think that's practical. And not only is it practical, it's more importantly reasonable. We have to have our dignity restored. And our dignity will not be restored until our economic power of the purse is realized, meaning that we have economic power. See, the problem is now we can call for boycotts, but many of us don't have the money to actually influence the boycott correctly. And my whole thing with reparation, once the dignity of a people's restored, now we can talk about making a true nation, building for the future, building for one another. Now, this is an off-the-wall question, Brother Pompey. What is your opinion on life outside the earth? Do you believe in aliens? Do you believe in spirits? Is there anything outside of the earth?
Yeah, I have a real simple belief in that. I believe that there are aliens outside the earth, and they scared to land because we haven't got it together yet.
We are the ghetto of the universe. Don't land on Earth. They'll have your spaceships on blocks.
Yeah, you know, their tour agencies say, no, not yet. Yeah.
But you know what?
I also want to say this, because some people, when I state my position, they say, well, you're not saying nothing about reparations and blah, 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 and so. Well, because I go back now to a point where And Dr. Claude Anderson, many of his beliefs are about special citizenship and indigenous rights. Or, you know, really, he's been saying it for a long time.
Yes, he has.
But back then, you know, there were a couple of lawsuits, and I was informed about one of the lawsuits from a very high-ranking mentor whose father was on the Oklahoma Supreme Court. All my cousins, especially the John Horse Band and Texas Seminoles, they were, yeah, we got a lawsuit and we're not going to have to pay taxes and we're going to free tuition and, you know, and casinos and everything. But I couldn't tell them that I had inside information that told me this, that there's no way they could win that right, that lawsuit for indigenous equality, and because of the Indians' sovereignty. In the final decision, and they went back twice to revisit it, was that the Indians have to give the black Indians permission to sue them.
Oh.
And that wasn't going to happen. And so so now here's the other reason why I go with indigenous. I see myself as a pathfinder. I'm only saying, go over here by this bush. I'm not a pioneer. I'm not a settler. I'm not all that. I think that after the Conyers years, when there was a lot of excitement about reparation and it cooled off, there was an idea that, well, since we can't get reparations over, let's go after black Indian treaty rights. My great-grandfather, Papa Caesar, was on that trail of blood on ice at the end of the Civil War in the 1865 Treaty of Fort Smith that ended the war in Indian Territory. He was a translator for the Seminoles, and he also signed. He couldn't write, you know, but he made his mark on that treaty. Now, the final version of it, it was a truce. The final version of it was a treaty signed 6 months later in Washington by another cousin, called the 1866 U.S. Indian Territory Treaty. And I can, which gave us, let's see, I want to just read the part that gives us those rights. So anyway, talk a little bit, Patrick, while I look for this on this desk.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. I want to go over a couple of comments by Brother Alfred in the chat room when he was talking about the latest. This is where the $5 Indians blanked or effed up our ancestors and us descendants. Yes, whenever you have people willfully basically selling out so that they get resources, they get money, their children's taken care of, but the greater people aren't, that's the reason why we find the situation we find ourselves in. Now, no one.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Now, here is the article in the U.S. Seminole Treaty of 1866. Just like we had the 13th Amendment, this is like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, but it was on the Treaty for Indian Territory. And it's only a paragraph. It says Article 2. And inasmuch as there are among the Seminoles many persons of African descent and blood who have no interest or property in the soil and no recognized civil rights, it is stipulated that hereafter these persons and their descendants and such other of the same race as shall be permitted by said nation to settle there shall have and enjoy all the rights of native citizens and the laws of said nation shall be equally binding upon all persons of whatever race or color who may be adopted as citizens or members of said tribe, whatever race or color who may be adopted as citizens or members of said tribe. So the problem is that the by-blood Indians haven't lived up to that article of that treaty.
Right. But we know why. I mean, look at that lady, Elizabeth Warren. You know, I'm a Native American, blonde hair, blue eyes. I'm Native. I'm going to take a DNA test. Took that DNA test, came back, not a drop up in her. Now, now the reality, and I live in a very rural area, okay? I've heard and I've seen more Elizabeth Warren types than I can shake a stick at. Oh, I'm Native American. I'm Cherokee. They always claim to be Cherokee, somehow related to Pocahontas. All these types that I come across. Now, the reality is this. We are the original people, not only of just this continent, but of this whole planet. There is no piece of paper written up by any human being that can ever take that from you. The only one that can take that truly from you is you, through your lack of knowledge, through your lack of understanding of self. And that, once again, was demonstrated by Brother Pompey's the systematic destruction of our past, the systematic destruction of our notions of self, to be replaced by consumerism and subservitude to the beast. And what I mean by subservitude, slavery, both physical and mental. Because we are doing things to ourselves that are on autopilot. These people, you know, people are quick to beat up and assault each other because we're melanated. Very few people are like Brother Pompey on the using facts and data and building a real coalition built upon dignity and respect for not just us, but the planet as well, to make a brighter future. We will not have a brighter future going the way we're going. Corporatism and consumerism will not bring about a bright future. It's going to bring about a nightmare Orwellian situation where computers and AIs running everything. You have no freedom of thought. You have no freedom of movement. I want freedom. I want to be able to worship the way I want to worship. I want to raise a family the way I want to raise a family. And I want to interact with my fellow human being the way I would like to for them to interact with me. And that's with peace and love as the root. Now, I'm not saying this is going to be kumbaya, because we even know in our own families, we can't get along with certain brothers, or can't get along with certain sisters, or can't get along with certain cousins and whatnot. But I'm telling you, as a member of the greater human race, which we all participate in, whether you want to accept this fact or not, we have to get it together. If not, we will be left as a footnote in the greater history of this planet. We will be the species that could have, but because of our intolerance and hate for one another, we didn't. And we will go the way of the dodo and the dinosaurs, never to be remembered, never to be honored.
Yeah, beautiful, Patrick. And I guess I'll wind it up with a little segment here. I didn't find out who my biological father was until I was 52 years old. Most of my life, I had a tremendous identity crisis. I was, as a result of that identity crisis, many things. I suffered from recurrent nightmares. 8 years old, I was violently sexually molested by a predator. I couldn't tell my mother because she was being physically abused by her living boyfriend, and I saw blood on the floor. At 9, I had a gang tattoo and carried knives to school. She married a man who had a business, and we moved out of the Nixon Garden Project in Watts, but the projects was still in me, and I continued acting out, and she put me out. And I was on the street. The police were looking for me, high and low. committing crimes on property. And the only reason they found me is because I attempted suicide by taking an overdose of drugs and drinking a bottle of iodine. Finally, I spent a year in 4 different juvenile institutions before I was 15. And so, but at Camp Joe Page, professional counselors of all races helped me to have a life. And so I'm just going to say that I don't do this because this is something that I want to do. I do it because it shows me. And since it shows me as a purpose, I'm afraid to not do it, because if a purpose comes to you that's for the greater good and you don't do it, what you want to do, you won't enjoy. Okay, I'll end it with this. What does it mean to be a Seminole Maroon descendant? Or do you have a final question you want to ask me, Patrick, before I read this a little bit?
No, absolutely. Go ahead. I just want to make one statement after you're finished, and then we can end the show.
Okay. So, what does it mean to be a Seminole Maroon descendant? Indigenous people believe that for every illness there is a cure, and for every purpose every person there is a purpose. I believe for right now, my purpose is to talk about my ancestors, the Seminole Maroons. When Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. took us to the mountaintop and showed us the promised land, the story of my ancestors was still locked in the stone upon which he stood. The truth of their story is the medicine that we will need to complete our promised land journey. The truth about them is that they were American patriots, not by choice, but by circumstance. They didn't have the leisure of meeting in halls dressed in finery to decide what they should do in the face of imminent oppression. I speak of my great-grandmother's people who fought an endless war of homeland security. I think of the women and children trapped at Fort Negro who were doomed to be destroyed. They were freedom fighters. Where is their honor guard? I see 2 tribal peoples who came together from 2 nature civilizations. One group was displaced because they were the First Nation, and the other group, torn from Africa, brought here without their consent, was obliged to be those of the Forced Nation. Undeniably, these 2 formed an alliance out of necessity. They would, for a time, fight together, die together, and survive together in a society under constant stress, living as embattled descendants of traumatic heritages. We must free their story from the stone and the stories of those who sought to help them. Only in this manner can their rightful place in history prevail as American patriots. These are my feelings and the reasons why I work to educate, promote, and increase awareness regarding African Native Americans in the Americas. It is my duty.
Wow, that's what I'm talking about. That's what a man does. Did you hear what he said? The last 3 words. It's my duty. Those words are very powerful. To conclude this report, I want to send out a very special thanks to Mark from Anaheim and Molly Bell, straight out of Compton. If it was not for these 2 individuals, this show would not be taking place, because it's through Molly Bell, Mother Molly, that introduced me to Elder Fixico. And it wasn't for Mark from Anaheim who introduced me to Molly Bell. This is what I envision the show to be about. Bringing voices I personally never heard of, but I am greatly indebted for these men and women taking it upon themselves to be on the right side of history. And with that, do you have any final words, Brother Pompey?
Yes, I do. I do, concerning my trip to the United Nations, where I'll have a chance to speak. I say this: when we were segregated and oppressed, there was 2 rules. The first rule to the community is don't do nothing to bring us down.
Right.
The second rule was, if you do something that is good for us, we will lift you up And I'm just asking. I've spoke 1,400 times and only received expenses less than 20 times because I worked for progress, not profit, of my ancestors' history. And I didn't want to profit off of their blood, sweat, and tears. But I'm going to say the second rule is it relates to that. I'm going to say somebody help get me to New York. And I just, need enough to get there and be there for a week. And so if you can help, if it's $5, fine. Brother Patrick, you are, what you're doing is a wonderful, wonderful service. And I thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. And if I can ever do anything for you, please call upon me and I'll be glad. Now, I'll report after I go.
Yes. Absolutely. Guys, I am not a fundraiser type guy. Seriously, you guys see me for the past 2 years. But just to add to that, without finances, without money in the war chest, the battle cannot continue. Now, brother is right. He's been in this game for a long time. And seriously, guys, put this on your heart and soul and in your mind. If he was about the ridiculousness, if he was about the foolishness, he would have made a bunch of money. And guess what? He would not be talking to us today. He would be on a jet somewhere eating shrimp and lobster because of all the money he made through the game. But this man is sincere and honest. You can feel it in his spirit and you can hear it in his words. I'm asking you, and I will put the GoFundMe link as soon as I can finish processing this video because it's live, obviously. But I'm going to put his GoFundMe link, and I won't put no link to my Patreon on this video. I want anybody who sees this video now or forever, if it's on them to give, I want them to give to Elder Pompey. I want them to give to the struggle and to restoring the dignity, and not just the Maroon Nation, but the total indigenous nation of these United States of America. We owe a debt to ourselves and to our ancestors to right the wrong and to restore the dignity and the honor of our people. And more importantly, we ourselves who are living must live up to the standards of the honor and dignity that has been hard pressed fought for us, and that will be bestowed upon us. But no longer can we be drug dealers and whores. No longer can we be gangbangers and just degenerates. We have to be strong men and women of our people and of this nation. As always, guys, live your life with integrity, without hate, envy, or greed. And as always, let's try to be kinder to each other. Thank you for listening. Peace. All righty, we are